So Kristen, can we get started?
Yes, it is 1 p.m.
Okay.
I will stop sharing my screen and I will turn things over to you, Chairman Palmer.
Thank you, Kristen. Good afternoon. I'm Chairman Don Palmer with the Election Assistance Commission. I'm the designated federal officer of the Technical Guidelines Development Committee, the TGDC. So I'm going to call this virtual meeting of TGDC to order. I have a few opening comments. I don't want to belabor it, but there's just a few things I want to go over before we get started. First of all, I want to thank every member of the TGDC for meeting today to discuss the important work of updating the VVSG, the Voluntary Voting System Guidelines, from 2.0 to 2.1. I want to thank the EAC staff whose hard work and expertise have developed the language we'll discuss today, and the NIST staff who've reviewed and provided their input. I want to thank Craig Burkhart, the acting director of the National Institute of Standards and Technology, for prioritizing his time to be here today and help lead the discussion. Director Burkhart is an attorney, so our paths have crossed a number of times over the past 2 decades. We have a good working relationship. You may not know this, but Director Burkhart, this is at least the second time at NIST. He was serving in the past as post 9/11 in an investigation into the World Trade Center fire and safety standards, and I'm sure you could correct me if I'm missing out on the details of that. But even more importantly, he's provided significant focus on the EAC and the Help America Vote Act once the bill had been passed, and he played a significant role in the establishment and the standing up of the EAC advisory committees, including the TGDC, and the development of the initial standards process under HAVA. So we're grateful to him, and he's going to be speaking in just a moment. Shifting to the business of today, since the president's executive order preserving and protecting the integrity of American elections, we've closely reviewed the language of the executive order that directly expressed the security concerns of the executive branch, and we take them very seriously, just as we did with the accessibility executive order of former President Biden. Since then, we've had the opportunity to, at the EAC to talk with election officials on the standards board representing the states, territories, and localities, and with their experts on the board of advisors, made up of members representing the executive branch, Congress, stakeholders, and of course, election officials about the potential impact of the EO and the best approach. And my approach from the very beginning is that I'm committed to making these changes work with the least negative impact on the states and election officials across the country. So as the professional team at the EAC developed the language for 2.1, we're now convening the TGDC with more details to consider language and opinions for the EAC to consider for 2.1 and to seek additional advice before we go to the standards board and to the board of advisors. So let's talk a little bit about the EO itself from my perspective, and obviously we're going to hear from our team at EAC. So the EO prohibits barcodes containing voter selections with the exception of supporting accessible voting for voters with disabilities. So this is incorporated into VVSG 2.0, but the language in 2.1 has been clarified to make this more apparent. Specifically, the only systems capable of producing barcodes are electronic systems that are required, to meet the accessible requirements in the VVSG, which also encompasses mandates to the ADA and Section 508 compliant to support accessible voting. So as you know, there are many stakeholders and experts who have warned against and opposed the use of quick response or barcodes. Litigation has gone on for quite a while. State legislatures ranging from Colorado to Georgia have banned the use or not even accepted systems with those features. And now the executive branch and President of the United States has communicated directly to us that those systems would be more secure without the QR code or barcodes containing embedded ballot information. Further, the EO states that there may be instances where a QR code or a barcode may still be a necessary element in accessible voting machines, so there'll be a need for that future to be standardized in testing. So of course, the EAC regularly updates and tests accessibility standards. and system requirements, but does not make policy on whether a state uses or does not use a certain feature. Policy issues on accessibility systems in your state, even down to the precinct level, will continue to reside in the states, and manufacturers will build systems to meet state needs and requirements. So what are the features of 2.1? One of those, besides the issue on the barcode, is the voter verified paper record. VVSG 2.0 does allow for future systems, but currently to not use paper in an effort to incentivize the development of innovative systems in the future. However, the requirements have been updated in 2.1 to require voter verified paper records, allowing voters to confirm their selections and provide for a durable, audible record of the vote. And this aligns with all known currently voting systems. So recently, the EAC commissioners adopted a policy on paper ballots to strengthen the direction of the agency in its commitment toward 100% paper-based systems in the field. And I would say that the recent EVE survey, what was just released yesterday or the day before, shows that we are on the right track and that 98% of the jurisdictions use paper ballots or paper-based systems. So many of the updates to the VVSG 2.1, the proposed 2.1 language, come out of the request for further information, or we call it RFIs, and other errata that have arisen over the past 4 years of testing and development of these systems. These updates will document those interpretations for the benefit of manufacturers and voters. So the TGDC's role is to give recommendations to the EAC and EAC director, executive director, during the process of revision and consultation. And your expertise and engagement are critical to ensuring that the guidelines remain both technically sound and practically applicable. We are open to your advice and recommendations. Hopefully you've had the opportunity to take the appropriate time to review the documents so that deliberations and discussions can focus on the effect, if any, on the updated elements to the VVSG 2.1 and what will the impact be on EAC certified voting systems. So it's hard to believe that it's been that long since VVSG 2.0 was approved by the EAC in February of 2021. But we are on the cusp of the first approval of a voting system to the new standards. And one of the first major tasks of the newly formed EAC over 20 years ago was to verify that voting systems comply with the functional capabilities, accessibility, and security requirements necessary to ensure the integrity and reliability of voting systems. While technology has made leaps and bounds in those 20 years, we still have those same requirements today. So let's focus today. My hope is that thoughtful and productive conversations as we discuss the next iteration of VVSG to ensure it reflects as a change in technology, policy, and public expectations. So that's my comments for today. I'd like to, again, I briefly mentioned the acting director of NIST, Craig Burkhart. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Craig and for your opening comments.
Thank you, Chair Palmer. I appreciate your kind words. And yes, as you mentioned before, you might say that I'm returning to the TGDC and the EAC because, yes, after the big Bush versus Gore election litigation and HAVA being passed and the tranche of financing that went out to the states to buy new equipment, which generally speaking was paperless DRE type equipment. We did get the Election Assistance Commission appointed, up and running, and then the TGDC, and then all of the advisory committees. Those were all things that I was basically staffing out as a lawyer and a parliamentarian all those number of years ago. So, and as Chair Palmer did represent, there was a time in my career when I was an active election attorney. Most of my time has been spent being a science and technology oriented attorney, but you might say that my avocation was election law, election integrity, and the efficient operation of election systems. So I couldn't tell you how much pleased I am to be back in this role as the acting director of NIST and as the deputy director of NIST. So I'm back as deputy director and happy to be here. So in getting the business forward, I'll just make a couple of comments, and then I'll ask the chair how he wishes to proceed from a technical standpoint in terms of consideration of the activities that we'll be having. So as has been mentioned, we really have two goals for the meeting. Goal number one, we're going to discuss that executive order on preserving and protecting the integrity of American elections, and we will then discuss draft VVSG 2.1. Now, for those of you who might be listening in who don't know what the VVSG is, it's the Voluntary Voting Systems Guidelines. And what it is it's at NIST, we're involved in issuing standards with the general industries, like the red light on the back of a tail light on the back of a car, that type of thing. In this case, the VVSG is actually issued by the Election Assistance Commission. So the TGDC, which is the Technical Guidelines Development Committee, we are just simply advisors to the EAC, which is the body that actually adopts the voluntary guidelines. So anyways, NIST and EAC are very excited to have for you an update to the VVSG that we're going to call 2.1. So what's that all about? Well, while the recent executive order did not specifically call for updates in the VVSG, it did call for the EAC to take certain actions that could be supported by the VVSG. So this new proposed version that we're calling 2.1 incorporates clarifications to the VVSG that the EAC made in response to questions from the test laboratories and the vendors. So now this particular version that we're going to discuss incorporates, I would call them minor fixes, and adds two new, what we call common data format specifications, which we will discuss. So these items were all discussed at the last TGDC meeting. So there's no new matters coming before the group today. So we will specifically discuss the changes to the VVSG by potentially recommending adoption of VVSG 2.1 per changes from the executive order. So anyways, thank you to the TGDC for all your great work on such an important topic. I'm looking forward to today's discussion. So, Mr. Chair, is it appropriate to turn this back over to you to declare or not declare a quorum, and perhaps you might instruct me as to how you wish me to cover the material?
So thank you, Director. We're going to do a roll call, I believe, where I'm going to introduce Monica Childers, who is our Assistant Designated Federal Officer, who has done a great job of organizing this and sort of making sure all the pieces are together so we can have this meeting. And so I'm going to turn it over to Monica. She's going to do a roll call of the members. And then following that, we're going to go just do some business about approving the agenda for the meeting, approving the minutes, that sort of thing. And then we'll start to hear from the content from our folks and from our testing and certification team. So why don't we get started? I'm going to turn it over to Monica.
Thank you so much, Chairman. Chair and members of the committee, we're going to do our roll call. If you'll please respond when your name is called, and do remember that you'll need to unmute yourself. Craig Burkhardt.
Present.
Thank you. Brian Caskey.
Present.
Thank you. Judd Choate.
I'm here. Thanks, Monica.
Thank you. Isaac Kramer.
Here.
Thank you. Diane Golden.
Here.
Thank you. Paul Lux.
Here.
Thank you. Mary Saunders.
Present.
Thank you. David Wagner.
Present.
Thank you. And Chris Wolashin.
I am here.
Thank you. That does constitute a quorum for today. I would also like to recognize the pending nominees who were able to join us today. While their nominations are pending, they are not recognized in the roll call and will not be able to participate in any votes the committee takes today, but we do value their input in these discussions and we thank them for their attendance today. I have two brief housekeeping notes. Members, please mute yourselves when you are not speaking. And if you would like to speak, please go ahead and raise a hand or drop a note in the chat, and we will make sure that you have an opportunity to speak. And I'll now turn it back over to the chairman.
Thank you, Monica. Appreciate that. So at this point, I think that we need to approve the agenda. So I'm going to call for motions to adopt today's agenda. That should be in the minutes from the previous TGDC meeting that has been sent to you. And so I guess we'll call on Paul. Paul has his hand up.
Commissioner Palmer, I would like to propose do we need to motion and approve and then discuss, or can I recommend a motion to update the agenda first? I'm not sure which order that gets done in.
This is a good question. I think that we could move to revise the agenda or add to the agenda. I do. One of the questions I have is technically, I think the director is handling the Roberts rules here. So I'm not sure I'm actually the appropriate person. Do you want to handle this, Director? Or would you like me to?
Well, I don't know what the informalities of how things have operated in the last 20 years or something that I haven't caught up to. I certainly know how to run a meeting, but I'm certainly happy to defer to your handling of these matters according to the way things have operated.
Sure. You're probably much better at this, actually, knowing your background, but I will do so. I'll do so, and then if I stumble, I'll let you advise me. So why don't we go ahead and Paul, you had a comment or a vision of the agenda.
I have two changes I would like to see made to the agenda. First, before we begin the second item, which is discussion of the implementation of the executive order, I think we need a short session to discuss other issues. Because I know there's a lot of stuff swirling around about this, and I think it's probably better to get all of that out of the way. And I would like to separate, the second change I would like to make is I would like to separate the last item, separate the vote on the VVSG draft to a separate agenda item rather than being combined with the discussion of issues and resolutions.
Any comment on or any input on that proposal?
I move to adopt Paul's changes to the agenda.
Okay.
I second that.
Okay. Paul, before we vote on that to modify the agenda slightly, I know there was, I was informed that there may be an appropriate time to talk about the appointment of members. Is that an issue that you want to address at some point?
It is, but I think at the beginning is probably better. I realize we all received the public comment just, I think, yesterday. And most of it, of course, it was very hard to beat my way through because most of it was cut and paste with the same issues. And I think we would just do better to address those issues up front. And there's a couple of questions I have, particularly pertaining to the membership that may or may not be relevant. I'll leave it in the hands of the lawyers to tell me to shut up. But
well, Mr. Lux, if it's one of the suggestions as I was considering is when we get our briefing from Camden Kelleher, our general counsel, that we could discuss perhaps at the end of that this issue, and we can, we don't want to belabor it too long, but I do want to have the body have the opportunity to discuss that. So, with that being said, there is a motion on the table. Go ahead, Paul.
I was just going to say, I mean, I can bring up my one issue now, and then we can maybe that would give legal time to look at the answer and discuss later.
So I would just note for everybody here, we have a motion for your amendments, Paul, that's been moved and seconded. So I think we need to consider that motion. And if that motion carries, then we'll conduct the agenda as you've proposed as amended.
Okay.
But at this time, if members have other discussions on the motion that has been moved and seconded, now would be the time.
So Mandy, I see your hand is up. Do you have a comment on the motion?
I do. I have a very brief comment. So if we have an opportunity to discuss kind of appointments, I will have some comments related to that and want to share some thoughts on that experience. But beyond that, on the motion to separate out the vote on the draft of 2.1, I just want to share, though I don't get an opportunity to participate in a vote, that I feel like that being on the agenda is premature overall. So I don't think that we're at a place, given the membership, nor based on the opportunity to review and discuss, that we're at a place to include a vote on the agenda at all. So that is my comment. Thank you.
Okay, we have a motion and we have another hand up. All right, Diane Golden.
Yeah, and this is a point of clarification, and it follows up on the previous comment. So do we need to have an agenda item that says vote? The agenda item is discussion of issues and resolutions where someone would move to vote on 2.1 or there would be no motion. It just feels odd to me to have an agenda item there that I mean, does that mean we have to vote because there's an agenda item that says we have to vote? Or is that an agenda item that says we have to discuss whether or not we're going to vote and how we would vote?
So, and I can leave some of this to the general counsel, but from my perspective, having served on the TGDC and been the designated federal officer, oftentimes advice and recommendations to the EAC are not necessarily in a resolution. It could be comments or letters. Some boards have provided resolutions or adopted. When I served on the TGDC, it was usually by consensus, but not necessarily a resolution. So it's been across the board. This is really an opportunity for if there was, if there was a meeting of the minds or a consensus of the board on certain language recommendations or recommendations to the EAC as we, as we look at this, that's an opportunity to do so. And I'll let general counsel clarify those comments if necessary based on Help America Vote Act.
Yeah, a vote is up to the membership. So whether or not there's an agenda item that says it or not, that is for you all to decide. And it would be a member that called a motion to vote on a recommendation. So certainly, definitively, Diane, to answer at least in part your question, if there's an agenda item, it doesn't require that you exercise a vote.
So, okay, we have a motion on the table to modify the agenda. Do we need to show the agenda, Camden, or are we good? We'll just separate out the two. I think
I would say that if our team has the capability to quickly modify the Word version of that agenda and show it, it would be great and helpful, though understanding that I don't know that we have that capability. It's not required either way.
Okay.
I think it's a pretty simple agenda.
Okay.
As long as members understand the amendments that have been submitted. If our tech team is able to get that up, that'd be great. If not, I think that we can close discussion and call for a vote on Paul's motion as submitted.
So it's been moved and seconded that the body adopt the modified agenda. Let's take a voice vote to adopt the agenda as modified. All in favor, say aye.
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 All opposed, say nay. All right, so the ayes have it and the agenda as modified is adopted. So now we move on to the previous minutes of the TGDC meeting in January. I'll now entertain a motion to adopt the previous meeting minutes as presented, sent by email prior to the meeting.
I move to accept the minutes from the, I think it was the December 2023 meeting, as amended because we got a second copy updating the original copy we were sent. So as amended in the second copy, we received a motion to accept those minutes.
I second.
Okay. It's moved and seconded, this body adopt the minutes. Before you, I will now take a vote to adopt the minutes. All in favor, say aye.
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 All opposed, say nay. So the ayes and nays, the ayes have it, the minutes are adopted. So the next issue on the agenda item is the discussion of the implementation of the executive order to protect the integrity of American elections. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Camden, our general counsel, Camden Kelleher, and turning it over to you, Camden.
So I would just note, Mr. Chair, I believe that with the modified agenda that was just adopted, we will open it to members for other business, which I'm happy to discuss conjunction.
So I see Paul Lux with his hand up. You're recognized, Paul.
Thank you. So what I did want to discuss indeed was membership from the perspective of the fact that, as was amply noted, we are missing approximately 40% of our membership. And one of the reasons that this concerns me, I think the most, is that when the TGDC was formed, if you look at US Code 2961 sub C sub 2, it says a majority of the members shall constitute a quorum except that the development committee may not conduct business prior to the appointment of all of its members. And given the fact that we have 4 of our 6 vacancies have people appointed to fill them and they have not been appointed, I just would like kind of a reading from you all on are we or aren't we allowed to conduct business based on that reading of the US Code.
This is Craig Barcode. I comment really on my my understanding of HAVA since I was there at the very beginning. And the intention, as I understand it, of that language, which you're citing, Mr. Lux, was that was at the very beginning, prior to the appointment of anybody. And so that language, the way that I took it at the very beginning, is it didn't allow us to begin with the TGDC until we had a full appointment. But from that point forward, then it would be on a rolling basis. And we would be able to conduct business on the basis of a quorum. When you think about it from just I guess, sort of a common sense standpoint, you would never be able to. There's a lot of times in these federal advisory committees, informally called FACA committees, very rarely are they operating at full strength with everybody appointed, if you will, to the slots. So my interpretation of that, as the chair of TGDC, would be that applied to us getting going at the very beginning, but that not having a full appointed number of people does not prevent us from moving forward with business at this time. Thank you.
All right.
So I have Diane's hand up. You're recognized, Diane.
Thanks. I'm just gonna throw out I'm not identifying code violations or anything.
Diane,
but
could you start over? You were breaking up, at least for me.
Sorry. This is not from a legal perspective. This is more from a practical concern perspective. With the way the TGD is set up, it has 2 required access board members, and those 2 are the specific people identified to represent the disability community and accessibility issues. I'm on as a technical expert, that my background happens to be accessibility. Moving forward with significant changes, and I have to say I disagree that the proposed changes are minimal or de minimis or minor or any of those terms when it comes to accessibility. I'm just terribly uncomfortable with me being the only person representing the accessibility perspective and doing anything, making any decisions about these proposed changes without those two access board members being official and appointed with voting rights.
Thank you, Diane. I see Judge Choate's hands up. Recognize Judge Choate.
Hey, thanks, Don. So I note that there are 5 people who are appointed who haven't been seated, at least according to the new membership information posted on the EAC website. I have pretty grave concerns about this as well, both the fact that the 2 access members haven't been seated and we're dealing with questions related to access in this meeting. And then I think the most grievous concern is that Mandy Vigil, who's on the screen here, was appointed 27 months ago to the TGDC, and in those 27 months has not been seated. And to me, that is in an entirely too long period of time for somebody to be in that status. And so I guess I would call on the powers that be to get that changed and get the other 5 people from the appointed status into the seated status. Specifically, I would just note that when Mandy was appointed, that was the same month that Fox News agreed to give $800 million to Dominion. I don't know about the rest of you, but that seems like a lifetime ago. And it should be sort of an indication of the fact that her appointment has been sitting out there for way too long.
Thank you, Mr. Choate. I see Brian Caskey's hand up. Brian, you're recognized.
Hi. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to belabor this a little bit, and I'd like to ask a question on what is the standard length of time for an appointment to be formally recognized and put on the board? And if there's not one, how can we create one so that there's some sense of urgency to process these appointments?
Yeah, I mean, I'll try to answer it just from a common sense perspective. I served on the TGDC, and the process did not take as long as it seems to be taking. Sometimes historic record is lost on what the TGDC is, how much vetting or background investigation must take place. And unfortunately, we haven't, at least the EAC has not been able to determine how we can speed up that process. I don't know if it's a security background check. I don't, we are not given information on that. But obviously we want the process to be efficient, although having due diligence into the whatever vetting takes place for these positions. And so I don't know if our general counsel has anything to add on that, but I will turn it over for his comment or the director. If not, we'll continue to address this issue. Okay, I don't. No one sees.
I can make a brief comment myself, and I'm not a direct actor in this. In that we've just arrived on the scene in the last 4 months, but just based on my experience before and completely unrelated experience, not in regard to the EAC, the clearance process is one which is has become quite slow in the last 24 to 36 months. I can't give you the rationale and the reasoning for it. I do know that after an election, we're at the quadrennial election, if you will. There often is a jam for security clearances and things like this that take place. So just in the last, say, 4 to 5 months, it's expected that there's a slowdown. But what the people commenting here are indicating is a much longer period of time and concern of that slowing down process. So I just share with you that it's consistent. This general slowing is consistent with most of the federal advisory committees in the last 24 to 36 months. I don't have their explanation for it. I will tell you this, that as the person, as the deputy director for NIST, to the extent that we can be of assistance in moving these things forward, I will do that. And so you have a commitment from me to work with the EAC to the degree to which I can provide some level of assistance. And I think I probably can. It's I have just found it through the years that it is a sense of frustration, and but I do believe we can get through it, and we can get through it in a meaningful way here. That said, we presumably, if the organization decides that it's not going to move forward with this, then of course you would be delaying the business of the EAC and the TGDC for some number of months. So my personal view is that we should go ahead and move forward with the business of the day, keeping in mind that we're going to have follow-up conversations, which I'm happy to participate in, to see if we can speed up the vetting process and the process surrounding that. Thank you.
Thank you, Director. Kevin, you're recognized. I see your hand is up. I think you were next.
Yeah, I wanted to bring it back to what Paul had originally asked, because I had the same concern that he did in reading the clause in HAVA about quorum. I understand what the director said about, common sense being that we had to wait till we had all of the listed stakeholders in HAVA in order to begin work initially. If that was the intent, I don't see why it seems common sense that would be desirable on an ongoing basis as well, not just at the start. HAVA takes great pains to list all those stakeholders and to make sure they all have a seat at the table. And I don't see any kind of indication that there's an expiration to that except clause. It's all one sentence, and it seems to apply. I'm not an attorney. I'd love to hear from the EAC's GC about how that's interpreted.
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in, Mandy. I know your hand is up. I'll respond to that and then turn it to you. But I'd just note that the EAC is in agreement with what the chair had, and I think not to get too far into statutory interpretation here, but it mirrors that of the initial appointment language at the top with members appointed. Also, an interpretation that differs from the ability for the TGDC to continue to operate without 15 seated TGDC members would mean that a singular member could vacate their seat prior to the meeting and potentially disrupt a VVSG process. And I think that clearly is against congressional intent. So the EAC does share the perspective that is for the initial appointment of members, and we can continue to operate here as we go forward. Now, I did want to note, though, however, in the initial conversations, it's perfectly acceptable for TGDC members to feel a certain way, to interpret a certain way, and that is solely within your right as you consider advice as we go through the process today. That is our interpretation of the statute. That looks more at back-end APA. And to Diane's comment, especially if it is a contemplation of 2.1 based on seated members, it is totally within your right to include that within your perspective, advice or recommendations presented to the EAC. So while we might differ on how we interpret that statutory provision, I do want to note that it's totally understandable if a TGDC member approaches things differently. And we'll have cordial conversations as far as those things go. So That might go without saying, but I'm going to say it. So sorry, Mandy, your hand was up.
Yeah, thanks, Camden and Commissioner. I certainly appreciate the conversation. There are a couple of points that I'd like to make sure we all have on the record. It has been not just a year, but we're talking, over 2 years. So I think there is a fair understanding that it's important to follow a process. I think what's not clear to me, though I have been seeking clarity for the past couple of years, is what is the process? And I see Commissioner Hicks has asked that question. I see that Diane in the chat has also shared that we all have security clearances, so I can speak to the fact that I've gone through that process as well. But I have not heard up to this day, nor during this discussion, what is the vetting process? What are the considerations? And what is the expectation of those appointments being made? I think Brian raised that, and I have not heard a response to that directly.
So to address Commissioner Hicks's comment, I can walk you through the EAC process, which each of the members outside of the technical experts, the EAC views as representative members. So the first step for the EAC in this appointment process is soliciting for all but those 4 expert spots or non-representative slots. So if it's a representative slot, including that of the Standards Board, the EAC solicits interest from Standards Board, Board of Advisors, IEEE, whatever the group appointing authority is, for appointment, and the EAC generally accepts whatever the board, the representative group's recommendation for appointment is. That's not required to. I think the EAC has historically always accepted whatever the recommendation is and then move that forward to NIST. In the technical expert slots, the EAC posts on the Federal Register when there's a vacancy, solicit interest, the commissioners generally review and move forward a recommendation on appointment to NIST. The vetting is done through NIST process, which is a Department of Commerce process, and I don't want to put the chair out, director out, understanding he's new to that process, but it is generally following the Department of Commerce's overall vetting process. And what that actually looks like is with the Department of Commerce. So I will pause there. If Director Burkhart has any comment, leave it to him, but that is at least the EAC part of that process.
Yes, I'll be glad to comment, and I'll also make some observations as a parliamentarian. As Chair Palmer expressed, I actually am an experienced parliamentarian, and in fact, I was the one who, all those number of years ago, wrote the rules that the TGDC then adopted for its procedures. So I might make just a couple of comments on that, and then I will address the vetting process as I understand it. First of all, when the TGDC originally convened, it adopted a set of rules which were approved by both the EAC and NIST. What those rules say is that a quorum, basically half plus 1, is authorized to conduct business. So on the issue of whether or not a full complement of members has to be appointed, as was discussed by the General Counsel, as the chair of the TGDC, it would be my opinion and it would be my ruling, if I was asked to do it, that we do have a quorum, and that according to the TGDC's own rules, that the business of the TGDC can move forward under its own rules, under the statute, and under Robert's Rules of Order at this time, because we do have a quorum. The requirement for a full complement of people to be appointed, or any number of things like that, those would be aspirational goals, but they would not control in this immediate circumstance. As far as the vetting goes, the vetting process is a lengthy process, involves security clearances and considerations of people's backgrounds and biographies. That's ongoing. And naturally, it's something which apparently, for reasons, again, that I'm not fully aware of, has been a lengthy process, apparently, these last couple of years. And so as I committed, to the extent to which I have an ability to be of assistance, I'm going to try to speed up the process of vetting people, and we'll look into, again, to the extent that I can, we'll look into what is happening with the Department of Commerce to the degree that it's involved in any of these considerations. But I think that this discussion, while illuminating and while important, is one which again is obviated by the TGDC's own rules, the statute, and Robert's Rules of Order, which would govern the decision being made here. So Mr. Palmer, who is acting as the chair of the committee, even though I am the chair of this committee, I guess at the right point in time, I would probably move to close the question and take a vote on whether or not we should move forward. Quorum has already been declared. So if somebody wants to make a motion that a quorum is not present, then that would prevent us from moving forward with business. Otherwise, quorum has already been declared and has been accepted, then we would be able to move forward with our business. Thank you.
Okay, so at this point, I'm going to move on to the next issue. Camden, are you next in line to discuss the EO?
I am. Yep.
Okay.
Is my screen reflecting appropriately, Chair Palmer? FACA membership overview.
Yes. Yes.
All right.
Kevin,
TGDC
shows your
Kevin,
notes.
we're actually seeing your driving screen, not your display screen. So we're seeing like where you can see next slide and all that.
How about now?
There you go.
There you go.
Okay. Yeah. Either way, there's no secrets. So, obviously the agenda item here is discussion of implementation of the executive order. But I want to capture your attention here and just do a quick FACA reminder, and then also walk through the general federal advisory committees for the EAC, which is related to the conversation on the discussion of the implementation of executive order. So just very quickly, a reminder for you all as members, these are the relevant laws and regulations that govern federal advisory committees. Obviously, HAVA is not included here. We've had that discussion. You know it's included, but calling your attention to the Federal Advisory Committee Act, the Government and the Sunshine Act, the Freedom of Information Act, and the Privacy Act. They're all relevant for you as advisory board members. Primary point of this quick aside is to remind you all not to trade on your position of the TGDC for personal benefit, and not to lobby Congress as a member of the TGDC. It does not prevent you from lobbying in your personal capacity, but you may not do so as a member of the board, and all of that must go through the EAC. So those two quick asides. I am going to walk through more of what is the Federal Advisory Committee, though this is part of our discussion on the implementation of the executive order. If you all had a chance, and I know it was noted that, public comment, some were repeated. I did go through the public comment. Big portion of the public comment was on this discussion piece. And I do just want to remind folks, some of you are going to be somewhat bored on this, and that the commissioners asked me to give this presentation as they did for the Standards Board, Board of Advisors, and the Local Leadership Council. So just running through what is obviously a discussion point for the EAC. And I am presenting in the same way that I did for them, though obviously there is a section of the executive order that is more relevant for the TGDC. I'll take just a couple minutes to go through and have a general conversation. Part of that does involve the federal advisory committees, because the federal advisory committees are baked into EAC processes on relevant topics. As you all know, the TGDC, and I just mentioned them all, TGDC, Standards Board, Board of Advisors, and LLC are our the EAC's 4 federal advisory committees. for the TGDC. I guess we've had this discussion in the other business for the most part. I'll note that the charter was renewed April 11th of this year. HAVA Section 221, which we've talked about, charges the TGDC with assisting the executive director in the development of the voluntary voting system guidelines. And then I think I've already run through the membership for the most part, so I don't want to waste too much time on these general overviews. Standards Board, for everybody's awareness, is 55 state and 55 local election officials selected through a process of the state chief election official. There's a 9-member executive board. I only note that because the 9-member executive board for the Standards Board is the only one called out by HAVA, and that is involved in the VVSG process, which I will talk about in a second. Overall, the Standards Board advises the EAC through review of the voluntary voting system guidelines, which is where the executive board is called out, through review of voluntary guidance, and through review of best practices recommendations. Similarly, the Board of Advisors really only differs from the Standards Board in that the Board of Advisors doesn't have an executive board that's specifically called out by HAVA, though they do have an executive board. And it is a 35-member representative board composed entirely of representative members by a selected list of groups, including congressional stakeholders. When I did this, I said I did this presentation for Standards Board, Board of Advisors, LLC. I listed out each of those 35, and that made this an incredibly disruptive slide. So I have not listed them out here, though the membership and appointing authorities are available on the EAC website. The Local Leadership Council, again, to keep presentations here consistent, is the only discretionary advisory committee formed by the Election Assistance Commission. The local leadership, and when I say discretionary, and I recognize that I'm talking very quickly, I think a lot of you have heard this before. If I'm going too quickly, members feel free to interject, stop me, and we can cover something in greater detail, though I'm trying to get to the point with some of the important background information. LLC is not defined in any of the processes because of the creation of the EAC as optional, and it's 2 members from each state local election official professional association. And the EAC developed a mechanism to get more direct to locals and hear feedback from the field through the Local Leadership Council. Separately, from the federal advisory committees established by HAVA is the NVRA process, and this is for the National Mail Voter Registration Form. In order to update the form, the EAC would need to go through a process to prescribe regulations, and this is to update the content of the form. We go through commissioner approval to do so, and then we'll go through notice and comment rulemaking, and this is to update the EAC regulations on implementing the contents of the National Mail Voter Registration Form. To do that, we would also need to go through a consultation with the chief election officials of the states to change the contents. So first part is rulemaking in order to do so, and then the second part is consultation with state chief election officials, as well as commissioner approval and a paperwork reduction act process. The VVSG process, which I'm going to slow down a little bit on because it's obviously most relevant to what we're talking about here today, is outlined specifically in HAVA that includes the EAC taking into consideration recommendations made by this committee. It also requires that the EAC executive directors submit the guidelines or modifications to those guidelines, which is in the realm of 2.1 as a modification to the Board of Advisors and Standards Board to review and submit comments on the recommendations. We must give Standards Board and Board of Advisors 90 days to do so, and final adoption of any modifications or general standards requires approval of at least 3 commissioners. HAVA also requires that we do a modification or a guideline adoption to allow for notice of the proposed guidelines in the Federal Register, opportunity for public comment on the proposed guidelines, an opportunity for a public hearing on the record, and a publication on the final guidelines in the Federal Register. In reviewing some of the public comments for today's meeting, and I know John will talk about the general process, especially as it relates to the life cycle policy that the EAC has adopted, I just want to clarify, I think there was misinterpretation on that agenda item we talked about where there was time for a vote. It was never anticipated, never planned, never thought that the EAC was going to take any form of vote on 2.1 today. We are at the first step of that process. Some of the public comments are simply on the fact that accessibility communities have not been consulted with on the development or the consideration of 2.1. That's because we came to TGDC first based on the process, and we'll have that opportunity for public comment if we go forward, when we go forward with VVSG 2.1. All of that covers general processes for both the NVRA, the VVSG, and now kind of interrelated. I'm going to get into, I think, again, I buried the lead here. I'm going to stop share. Hopefully you didn't see my crowded desktop. However, moving into a conversation, the discussion of the implementation of the executive order. So again, this is a conversation we've had with other federal advisory committees, and we'll do the same, though understanding this is more tailored. First of all, Section 2A was a section of the executive order that directly touched on the Election Assistance Commission, which requested that the EAC update the National Mail Voter Registration Form to include documentary proof of citizenship. The EAC originally sent a consultation letter to state chief election officials as required by the NVRA process that I just discussed on April 11th. On April 24th, that section of the executive order was enjoined by the court, and the EAC rescinded that original consultation letter. The preliminary injunction remains in effect, though the EAC did send a letter on May 27th, 2025, separate from implementation of the executive order to state chief election officials to better understand how that form is being used and its usability generally in the states, and its impact for election officials. Moving on to Section 4A, which asks that the EAC withhold federal funding based on the acceptance of the form. The EAC does not currently have funds to withhold, so there was $15 million through the continuing resolution this year that was separate from what is identified for funding to be withheld under the executive order, as well as the Section 2A is enjoined, and the EAC can't enforce that provision through withholding funds on 4A. 4B is the section I expect that we will talk most about following me shutting my mouth a little bit here, but it essentially, in short, and I understand that we're going to have discussion on this. So in short, 4B asks the EAC to update the voluntary voting system guidelines, and I want to get this language right, in that the voting system should not use a ballot in which a vote is contained within a barcode or a quick response code in the vote counting process, except where necessary to accommodate individuals with disabilities, and should provide a voter verifiable paper record to prevent fraud or mistake. Subsection 2 of that then asks the EAC to take appropriate action to review, and if appropriate, recertify voting systems under the new standards and rescind previous certifications of voting equipment based on prior standards. That is 4B in its totality. Again, let me go through my general presentation on the implementation of the executive order, and I promise we'll get back to conversation on 4B. 4C asks the EAC to report to the Department of Justice discrepancies or issues with an audited state certifications of compliance with federal law to the Department of Justice. Section 4D of the executive order did ask the FEMA and the Department of Homeland Security to heavily prioritize compliance with VVSG 2.0 in the implementation of Homeland Security grant programs. I will note quickly that Section 6B requested the DHS consult with the EAC on a review of the security of voter registration systems. Section 7B also asks that the EAC withhold funds based on or condition funds on the acceptance of the National Election Day. That section is also enjoined, but for the 13 states that permit mail ballots to be received after Election Day currently. And again, the analysis is for the EAC was that it did not apply to the 2025 funds made available for election security grants through the continuing resolution. Section 9 asks the EAC to report to the administration on actions that addressed, and Commissioner Palmer addressed this, Executive Order 14019, which is promoting access to voting. And with that, that is the executive order as it pertains to the EAC. In short, Judd, I see that your hand is up, so go ahead and just kick us off in the general discussion, please.
Yeah, so I have kind of just a procedural question. So as it relates to the injunctions, is it the EAC's interpretation that the Trump v. CASA decision means that at least in 25 days or 24 days, that the injunctions will only apply to the litigants in the cases, so the 19 states in the Massachusetts case and the joined parties in the DC Circuit case, and because of that, these will no longer be, national injunctions?
We haven't fully formulated that at this time to comment, though I would say that for 2A, a single party injunction would hold on 2A as far as injunction, given that the form is the form. Sorry, the form is the form is not a very academic way to present that, but any modifications, any preliminary injunction that maintains on the federal form, there's a singular federal form, so we wouldn't be able to take independent actions on the form if there is a singular injunction in place. Diane, you guys are also polite with your hands up, but if there's a moment of silence, please just jump in.
A clarification, because I ran out of steam to look through all of the comments, and I started trying to do searches to look for ones that were coming from blocks of organizations and coalitions. And I need somebody to help me understand. I won't get this right, and I didn't print it because it was hundreds of pages, because they attached their actual litigation. The comments that came from, I think it was Brennan and League of Women Voters and a laundry list, that one. I looked at it, and then I looked at the case and said, okay, it's already too late. I can't do that. So are they saying that the things that we're talking about, those things that apply to the VVSG, they have filed litigation about those, or has the litigation and injunctions all been about voter ID and the registration cards and all other kinds of parts of that executive order, and not the parts about the actual certification standards?
Yeah, so there's litigation that challenges Section 4B of the executive order, but it was not included in any preliminary injunctions. So in the comment that you're addressing, I think that, and I don't want to overly simplify, but at least the comment submitted to the EAC there is that there is a preliminary injunction on 2A based on the president's authority over the form, and that it's requesting that the EAC apply that same logic to 4B without a preliminary injunction in place. And again, I don't want to overly simplify that. I'm happy to circulate those comments. But that is my read that we can apply similar logic to not being required to implement 4B based on existing litigation and then holdings within the preliminary injunction. Though I would draw the distinction in the fact that 2A invokes the National Voter Registration Act, whereas the voluntary voting system guidelines are totally under the Election Assistance Commission and are voluntary, whereas the National Voter Registration Act is a mandate.
I don't know if this is the right time because this is a completely different question, but if I've got the floor, I've got the floor, I guess. So I'm and I actually pulled up the EO language again so that I get it right. And this is the barcode issue. The way the EO reads, it talks about not using a ballot in which a vote is contained within a barcode or QR in the vote counting process. I am emphasizing in the vote counting process, tabulation, except where necessary to accommodate individuals with disabilities. So there are no accommodations for individuals with disabilities in the counting process. The access features are in the ballot marking, verification, and casting, but once it's cast, there's no accommodations for tabulation. Tabulation is just back in. So I'm a little confused just by the plain reading of the EO about what it was trying to do.
Chair Palmer, do you have a response to that, and that we're getting a little technical here?
I think that the best person to articulate that would be either Brooke Waters or John Panic, and they are going to present on sort of what the language of 2.1, what the draft is now, and they may be actually able to address that question directly, much better than I probably could. So if there are no other questions on this, we can move to their presentation, and obviously we can have discussion on that as well. Judge, you had an additional question on this particular issue, or not the issue,
Yeah.
but this part of the agenda?
Yeah, I do, Don. Thanks. So the question I had was related to 4B. Have the commissioners sort of come to a conclusion about the decertification, recertification requirement of the 4B wording? Because it seemingly suggests that all systems which are certified at 1.0 must be decertified and then recertified at 2.0. I suppose there are other readings of it, but that's the way I read it. Does the EAC, do the commissioners have thoughts on how that process would go, or if it is even legal to do that? Again, my reading of the law suggests that it's probably not legal to do what the executive order contemplates. So I'm handing that problem back to you guys. I'm just curious what you plan to do about that.
Well, it is a separate issue than the VVSG, but obviously you've raised this issue. It's come up at the other board meetings. I think primarily the commissioners have not come to a conclusion on that, primarily because it goes to the scope. How broad or narrow do you read the executive order? And I think that that issue of decertification is something that is separate, which the commissioners will be addressing, and what 1.0 systems that are perhaps no longer supported, no longer being supported by the manufacturers or being updated, no longer being used. There's a number of systems out there that could be decertified, but I speculate. I think that we have not yet come to any conclusions on that, but it really does come down to the scope of the how narrow or broad of a reading. And we've got some really good advice coming from our board of advisors and any other FACA boards that that perhaps that is a more narrow reading of that is the correct reading. And so we're still working on that issue, but it is separate from my perspective. The whole decertification and review of 1.0 systems is separate from what we're dealing with on sort of the VVSG and the barcode issue. And I'm one commissioner, so, but I think that's where we are. Mandy, did you have a comment? Mandy.
Yeah, thanks, Commissioner. I guess I just wanted to kind of provide some comments on something that I heard Camden mention. I think we agree that from the federal perspective, the voting system guidelines are voluntary. I do want to bring to the attention of the committee that certain states like our own, and I know there are several others, our state law actually requires that we comply with federal guidelines, which I think is a positive policy, that we have some uniformity, but ultimately I just want to make sure that folks understand calling it voluntary for some of us does not equate to that being a voluntary guideline. And with that in mind, I would just also expand that whether our state code requires it or not, as election officials, perception is out there. There is an expectation that we are meeting best practices and considerations of appropriate standards. So I just ask that we consider all of this within the context of voluntary. I don't think is a realistic approach to standards when it comes to voting systems.
Thank you, Mandy. Paul Lux.
I would just add to that as well. So, I mean, here in Florida, as you certainly know, Commissioner Palmer, we have our own voting system certification process that we go through. And so what is and isn't in the VVSG is a little less critical for us. But certainly, we as Mandy alluded to, we do get an earful quite often from people who want to know why we're not complying with VVSG 2.0 since it's been passed since forever. And of course, naturally, as I pointed out at the standards board meeting a couple of months ago, right now we have exactly 0 systems certified to 2.0. And changing them again isn't going to improve that. And so decertifying anything within 180 days of us changing from 2.0 to 2.1 is going to be nothing but catastrophic for the states like New Mexico and other states that require under their state law following the VVSG guidelines. I mean, if you tell somebody buy new voting equipment and there's no new voting equipment certified to buy, I'm not sure you've assisted in the process at all. So that's my biggest concern about the charge in 2B section 4B2 to talk about decertifying anything at this point.
Thank you, Paul. So seeing no more hands, I'm going to turn it over now to Brooke Waters and John Panic to provide a presentation on the proposed language.
Great. Thank you, Chairman. Can everybody hear me okay?
John, yes, we can hear you. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you. All right. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for being here today. I'm John Panic, the EAC's Chief Election Technology Officer, and I'm pleased that we're here virtually to discuss the first draft VVSG 2.1 that we put forward for consideration by this committee. Today marks an important step in our shared responsibilities to ensure the VVSG remains clear, current, and responsive to the evolving needs of voters, election officials, and the entire elections community. Next slide, please. So I thought it would be helpful to go over a little bit of process and to show with the visual here. I know Camden described a lot of this during his part on the HAVA process, but a visual, of course, is helpful. And so what we've got on this slide here shows 2 processes, the VVSG review process in green and the VVSG update process as specified in HAVA in blue. And you can also see where we are here today's meeting at the beginning of that HAVA process. So to dive in a little bit about what the VVSG review process is and means and where it came from, This was ultimately derived from TGDC resolutions that were passed unanimously on September 20th, 2019, during a meeting discussing the VVSG 2.0 principles and guidelines. Resolution 1 from that meeting recommended that the EAC adopt a yearly VVSG review process. And resolution number 2 called for the EAC and NIST staff to make minor technical changes efficiently. So those resolutions were implemented in our VVSG lifecycle policy. This is a policy that we drafted and was approved or adopted by commissioners in 2022. And the lifecycle policy defines a handful of things, major, minor revisions and what those mean, how we conduct the annual reviews, and then when the decision is made for an update, how that proceeds. It reiterates the HAVA process. And so with that, since 2023, we've been conducting annual reviews on the VVSG. It is a new thing with that policy passed in 2022. The proposal to draft VVSG 2.1 was presented in the 2024 annual report that is posted on our website. And then those proposed changes that are in this draft were then presented to TGDC in January of 2025. Generally, they were met positively based on that discussion. And so now here we are today discussing the actual drafted language of VVSG 2.1 with the TGDC, and it's with them for their review and recommendation. So I want to say a couple things just on today's meeting and recognizing that there was some concern about mention of the vote on the agenda. And I know Camden covered that pretty well. We recognize that the committee may wish to deliberate further after today's discussion, and we're absolutely prepared to accommodate that. Once this committee decides to provide its recommendations, we then proceed into the blue section. And this is the HAVA process. So that's where we are today. I won't belabor it too much because Camden did go over all the points that are spelled out in HAVA, but ultimately the recommendation comes from TGDC first, and then to the Standards Board and Board of Advisors for their review and recommendation, our other statutorily mandated FACA boards. And from there, Federal Register, 90-day public comment period, a public hearing, and then at that point, the commissioners may vote on a final version for adoption. So that will be sometime in the future, of course, and not today. Of course, HAVA was drafted intentionally to have this structure to ensure that it's an open review process and that input can be obtained from stakeholders. So one other thing I want to clarify, the draft VVSG 2.1 does not contain or introduce any changes related to certification or decertification. As Chairman Palmer mentioned, that's a separate process. Any future consideration for existing certification policy would be addressed through that separate process, and that is contained in our program manuals. Lastly, I want to mention we understand the changes in this draft based on the Executive Order 14248 have drawn significant attention, but it's important to underscore that the work for this draft was in motion. As of last year, we proposed a draft VVSG 2.1, and we discussed it with the TGDC in January, and that we're fully transparent that it has been amended to include points or considerations from the executive order, and we will discuss that shortly. So with that, I'll turn it over to Brooke Waters, our Director of Testing and Certification, and she will go into the changes in more detail.
Thank you, John. Can everyone hear me all right?
Yes.
Wonderful. Let's go to the next. So as you all recall, at our last meeting in January of this year, it was recommended to this committee that there be a minor version update for VVSG. Given that the VVSG 2+ family is designed to be more dynamic and allow for easier iterations than its predecessors to keep up with technology and changing election environment, We are looking to include the errata corrections, incorporate published requests for interpretations, RFIs, and 2 new common data formats, or CDF, specifications published by NIST. And there is consideration for the Executive Order 14248, Section 4B. Some of this may be a repeat of what you saw in January, but just to go over for the record. Chapter 9 of the Testing and Certification Program Manual defines a request for interpretation, RFI, as a means by which manufacturers and voting system test labs may request the EAC to provide a definitive interpretation of a VVSG requirement when, in the course of developing or testing a voting system, the meaning of a particular requirement is ambiguous. An interpretation issued by the EAC serves to clarify what a given standard requires and how to properly evaluate compliance. This chapter goes on to outline the requirements and procedures for submitting an RFI. We have 12 published RFI responses on our website answering questions of requirements on behalf of stakeholders who are either implementing or testing to VVSG 2.0. These published RFIs are in effect and applicable to all systems being tested to the VVSG 2.0. Incorporating RFIs into the new draft works to consolidate the information into a single location. As a result, we have added 1 new requirement to align with the RFI from 2023, the ID 2023-01, regarding a question on requirement 10.2.4, which is logging of ballot selections. The resulted new requirement is 13.1.2-B, election record modification. Note that not all updates due to RFIs have resulted in modified requirements. In some cases, only informative discussions have changed. The 2 new CDF specifications from NIST are the ballot definition common data format specification, which describes a CDF for interchange of logical and physical ballot style information. This has added the requirement 41G into the draft. And then the optional micro common data format specification, which would be used in space-constrained environments, such as the placement of machine-readable data on paper, which has added the requirement 41H. For the executive order, section 4B, specifically I, of the executive order calls for prohibiting the use of barcodes containing voter selections with an exception for supporting accessible voting for voters with disabilities. How we understand it, this is already the case in VVSG 2.0, but the language has been clarified to make this more apparent. Specifically, only systems capable of producing such barcodes for electronic systems must meet the accessibility requirements in VVSG 2.0. This is the beginning to Diane's answer regarding it's not the tabulating equipment, it's the equipment that produces the barcode, and we can go into that further in our discussion. The EO also calls for the use of voter verifiable paper records. VVSG 2.0 cannot allow a paperless system without using an EAC-approved cryptographic end-to-end verifiable, or ETEV, architecture. There are currently no EAC-approved crypto ETEV protocols, and there will not be for years to come. The changes made to the VVSG are updates to the language from a paper-based architecture, the term paper-based architecture, to the terms voter verifiable paper record. This is the change that's largely seen. There is also a change that removes the pathway for a paperless system being certified under VVSG 2.1. This does not affect the EAC's ability to certify any existing systems and may be revisited as new voting architectures are developed. Before ending, I would just like to also add that if need be, we can do further clarification on the difference between a minor and major revision as called out in the life cycle policy. From an earlier comment, I just want to note that VVSG 2.0 will still be an active set of standards that can be submitted against if we were to proceed forward with 2.1. Manufacturers would have a selection of what they would like their system to be tested to between the 2 options. And with that, I can hand it back to the chair.
Any comments or questions? I see Judd Choate's hand up. I recognize Judd.
Thanks, Don. And I appreciate the, description from John and Brooke. So I know that this may sound sort of non-substantive, but I do have concerns about the way we got here. So as I remember it, in our last meeting, we were introduced to the idea of the 2.1 revision, and it largely got a negative response from the TGDC because we have sort of the public understanding concerns and the fact that we were midstream in certifying these couple of new systems, and these new systems then would be certified to 2.0 when we're adopting a 2.1. We'd have to convert them to a 2.1. There were just a lot of things that we needed to work through and think about. And so we were generally pretty negative as a group about the idea of shifting to a 2.1. So bookmark that. Now we're looking at a 2.1. I understand why, I understand how we got here, but we're looking at a 2.1 now. And I'm looking at the first page. And again, I understand that this may not be the most substantive point we're going to hear today, but the opening page says that it's at the direction of the TGDC. And it's clearly not at the direction of the TGDC. We did not vote to create a 2.1. And so, yes, this is a draft that, if we did adopt, I guess it is at our direction, but it's really not. We didn't direct this. This isn't our creation. So I'm just uncomfortable with the way that this is being constructed. You all speaking to the EAC, do the drafting of some of the work that we do. And so I do understand that there's this sort of odd way of constructing that in language that would show up in a document like this. But I just want it publicly to be known that we did not ask the EAC to come up with a 2.1 draft. And it certainly was not in our direction as far as I know.
I appreciate that comment, Judd. I think that it is really a deliberative process. As Mr. Panic talked about, we have an annual review. At points we've received hundreds of comments on that. That's not including the RFIs that we received during testing. It's not including other input that we receive. And so we understand that if there's going to be a draft for the TGDC to consider, it's going to likely come from the EAC and NIST. So I don't think there was any intent or bad intent by the staff in the drafting of that. We recognize that. And so point well taken. This is an annual iteration process, though. Obviously, it's a little bit different because of the urgency of the EO and the fact that we are sort of completed a lot of the testing on 2.0 systems. And this is, I can be corrected on this, but there have been 12 to 14 RFIs. That is something that, the more clear you can be in a 2.1 that these are the requirements of these systems, it does provide some clarity. But I do think that the reason we're having a virtual meeting is because of the urgency of the requests and the fact that we still have these things that we could incorporate into a 2.1. That's my opinion. But John, if you have any other sort of, we take your point. We don't want anyone to be misled, but because we take the responsibility of sort of what will the draft look like based on what we do our own vetting, and then obviously NIST is reviewing that. We may even have working groups on this type of thing, but that's what I have to say about it. If there's any other comments from the staff, otherwise we'll go to the next comment.
Yeah, thank you, Chairman Palmer, and thank you, Judd, for the question. For us, I mean, our perspective on it is that this is the formal language that appears in VVSGs. So taking the one draft and moving it forward to the next, if it made folks more comfortable, we can certainly delete that until we get direction or some recommendations. It's just a placeholder for what it would eventually say upon recommendations and adoption. And so not meant to be meaningful beyond that.
I appreciate that. Thanks.
Thank you, John. I think Mandy's hand was up next.
Yeah,
Recognize
thanks,
you, Mandy.
Commissioner. Thank you. I just kind of I think that helped with part of my question and confusion, because though I wasn't able to be present in January, kind of my takeaway from the fact that there was not a quorum, the minutes that were drafted were not able to be approved based on that. It was confusing to me in the presentation that there was mention that the January meeting resulted in a recommendation from the TGDC. So from what I hear after kind of Judd's question, that is not accurate. There was not a recommendation made in January for this draft to be created. So that is cleared up for me. But the second piece that came up, I think, was in part the discussion about barcodes. So what I saw on the slide was that 2.0 already included language about barcodes being specific to being used for accessibility reasons alone. I guess that feels off to me. Like I don't agree with that statement, and I would appreciate if I could get some clarity on where that language is. Because what's being presented is that 2.1 is simply clarifying language that was already in existence, and that does not align with my understanding. So can we get some direction or clarity on the language that was already in 2.0 that speaks to barcodes for accessibility only?
John, do you want to handle that question or?
Yeah. Absolutely. Thank you, Mandy. Just to clarify for the record, I don't believe I said we received a recommendation from the committee in January, but that the draft was presented and received positively. I think Judd disagreed with that, which is okay. At this point, sitting here, I'm basing this on my recollection of the meeting, but we can revisit. But ultimately, recognizing that we have not received recommendations on draft language or for making a draft. Essentially, what we're doing here is taking the next step. I don't think that it's essential for the committee to recommend a draft be generated before we do that. We're putting it forward here preemptively by saying, okay, if we want to consider whether or not a draft would be important, here's what it would look like, and that better informs a discussion rather than not actually having language in front of us. And so in my mind, we're not any further down the line from waiting for the TGDC's recommendation on what it is that we put in the draft. And the second question regarding the thought that this exists already in VVSG 2.0 about barcodes. So the thought there, and I'll let Brooke expand on this if she's got any additional thoughts, is that barcodes in 2.0 that are used for storing voter selections are exclusively for, or the only way that they can be used is for accessible voting. And so it, in our opinion, aligns with what is being asked for, although it doesn't actually say that explicitly anywhere in 2.0. And so that language is an attempt to strengthen the point that you can't have non-accessible equipment using, it's a strange thought to even say that because it's all accessible equipment, but those devices should be conformant to all the accessibility requirements, and that's the only type of system that can generate a barcode. So the outcome here isn't any different based on the language, at least in our opinion.
Correct. Just to clarify real quick, the language was from me about the recommendation, and it was saying that we, as the EAC, brought a recommendation to the TGDC about looking at a minor version update to the VVSG. So I can understand if I didn't articulate that well. So my apologies. Yes, there was no recommendation from the TGDC back in January. John is correct. I don't have much more to echo around the barcodes, other than that it's the language in 2.0 is not explicit, but in 2.1 we try to make it explicit. In 2.0, how it's being used and all of the requirements regarding barcodes and open source access to them, or if you have voter selections stored, I believe that's a 915C. Or 915A through D. If voter selections are stored, they must be accompanied by a human readable format as well. So it's just really to kind of drive the point home that the only time you're really going to see this is as a resulted ballot from an accessible equipment. Instead of 4 pages, you have a summary and something easy for tabulation. That's how we're
I
seeing it.
appreciate that. I appreciate that. I agree that it's not explicit in 2.0, and so I appreciate you all kind of helping me understand kind of what you originally presented. The last thing, Commissioner, if I may, was just to comment on this idea of the vendors, right? And we have vendors that have not made it through 2.0 yet. And now we're talking about a 2.1. And so I definitely have a concern as to timing. And I think that sounds like what was discussed in January still exists as a concern. And so, Brooke, you did mention that vendors would have a choice, right? But ultimately, election administrators are the stakeholders, right? Alongside being able to provide for their constituents and voters. So, what does that mean for states like ours, where 2.1 is going to be the newest? Should this move forward, and when and if it moves forward? So, this idea of a choice for vendors, I don't think gets to the deeper issue of states not having a choice, right? If there are new and improved guidelines that clarify items, that would be the appropriate, I think, version for vendors to be testing to. So what can you tell us about the timeline and what we can expect, and what the EAC kind of position is on being able to support election administrators on this idea of a new version when we're not even through the first one? And we've been on this kind of timeline, I think, of an annual review, and we're outside of that precisely because I think of the president's executive order. So we are out of kind of the usual timeline of things, and what can we expect? And what have you had discussions with vendors about their ability to meet the standards of 1.0 at this point in time?
Well, so the conversation back in January, and I know that John will tag in here, uh, the change was meant to be, minor is not quite the right word, but I fear as though if I pick another word for it, it won't quite hit the mark. The only change that you're really seeing is these 2 new common data formats, as well as just a cleanup of the document. So this ability to come in under one or the other is to simply say they've done the work to support these common data formats. It's really just one, because the other one is an optional in situations where you don't have enough space, right? The micro common data format specification. So 2.0 is still the new and current. And we can see if the manufacturers didn't have that at that point in their development cycle, or they're able to add it in, it's just a very small change. If they've already gone through, let's say, and they wanted to add support for it, well, we would want to make sure we do that testing. It would be a very quick turnaround to show that, yes, they can meet one or the other. So, John, I guess, do you have more that might help answer this question?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Brooke, and thank you, Mandy, for the question. I think there's a number of things at play here. One of them is that the language of legislation provides a challenge in your state because you're calling for the latest, greatest. And I know we've had discussions in the past about how, The challenge with that is that if you're saying that you must be using the latest system tested to the latest VVSG2, there's a period of a number of years where those systems aren't available. And so we've also talked about this whole idea of making smaller iterative changes is something this committee asked for to do it more frequently. And we're literally at 4 years since VVSG 2.0. And so while there aren't systems certified to it, maybe we're not sensitive enough to understanding what the challenges are on the state side, but on the other hand, not updating it and letting it languish for 10 plus years like we did last time is not ideal either. And so we're putting a lot of work into trying to meet that ask to be more agile and make more frequent updates. And it's being met with concerns that weren't maybe part of the discussion when the resolution was passed in 2019. So if that's something we need to revisit, I think we're happy to do that if it's just moving at a pace that's a little too quick for the community. But I think it's important to try to normalize the idea of updating the standards on a regular basis. If we look at other industries that do these sorts of things, a 5-year period is maybe a common thing. And it's not seemingly impactful for those industries because this is kind of a standardized process, where here in the election community, it's actually unusual. I've heard people say this is very unusual to see a draft 2.1 so quickly. Last time it took 10 years, but we don't want that. And so hopefully that helps kind of clarify the situation where we're trying to be responsive. And if it's causing problems, we'd maybe like to have a deeper conversation about that.
Thank you, John. I have no idea who's next, but I'm going to let David Wagner go next because, Paul, I think we'll get back to you. We'll get to everybody. Mr. Wagner.
I thought I'd continue on from comments from Judge Choate that I share the concerns about the phrase that this was prepared at the direction of the TGDC. My understanding is that historically, the kind of the past practice has been that typically the TGDC has identified what content it wants to recommend in a proposed standard, and then asked NIST to assist with drafting language, and then brought that to the EAC. And I think the process on this one was a little different, that the EAC has prepared this and brought this to the TGDC. And so I'm not saying that's good or that's bad. It just is different. And so if we proceed to voting on this proposal today, I'd like to bring a resolution to remove the statement that this is prepared at the direction of the TGDC from the draft. And perhaps Chair Burkhart could advise me on the appropriate time to bring that before the body. And if we're not going to vote on that, then maybe we don't need to need a resolution on that today.
Thank you, Mr. Wagner. There'll be some time at the end, and we'll make sure if we move in that direction, I'll recognize you. So, thank you. All right, so I think Wesley Wilcox will recognize you.
Thank you, Chair Palmer. I have a question concerning reconciling multi-versions with the executive order. The Section 4B2 rescinds all previous certifications. So if someone can come in, how can you submit to a version that's already, according to the EO, been rescinded? I just don't reconcile that. Maybe that's for Brooke or John.
I'm going to pass this one to Camden, actually.
So the executive order, and I just froze for a second. You guys hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yes. All right. The executive order does not rescind any certifications independently. It asks that the EAC consider it following. And I went through my presentation, and I want to make one point of clarification, especially for the commissioners that aren't joining us today. Commissioner Palmer noted that there's not a conclusion on 4B2. And I think the other commissioners would appreciate me noting there's not necessarily general EAC consensus on the required implementation of those. On behalf of the commissioners, I make that statement, and I would also go to, at a floor, I think the commission is in agreement that the President of the United States is an important stakeholder and has expressed his views on what he would like the EAC to do. So the executive order itself does not rescind prior certifications. It asks the EAC to consider that following a process of adoption of updated standards. John, correct me then, in the event that there is a 2.1, that would be we have our sunsetting principles, and there would be existing systems to submit to certification to. And a system that has received a rescinded certification is a prior certification. That is, if a system was certified to an earlier standard and meets the requirements of the updated, they can submit to certification that exact system if it meets the updated requirements.
Yeah, I think we've got a number of complexities there. Generally speaking, 1.0 systems aren't compliant to 2.0, at least not that we're aware of. And so failing agreement on a policy or interpretation on that, I'm having a hard time coming up with an answer on what that means for previously certified systems. But for 2.0, at least according to our life cycle policy, a 2.1 and a 2.0 will live side by side, and that the existence of a 2.1 does not sunset or have any impact really on a 2.0 certified system. To be a little more specific, any system that is certified to 2.0 would be a modification if it wanted to move to 2.1. So it wouldn't be a heavy burden, and the changes wouldn't be significant. We maintain that still with the changes that we have in this draft. It's not a significant difference between 2.0 and 2.1.
I recognize Chris Bloschlin. You're recognized. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner, and it's an honor to be a part of this group and have these weighty discussions. I represent the industry, that circle of certified manufacturers. I have sought comment and outreach to the major top 4 or 5 tabulation manufacturers, and the comments that were made to me regarding the new revised language that is contained in the 2.1 draft regarding barcodes and paper ballots and paper trails. The vendor community has no major concerns with adopting those new or revised sections as written in the draft. No major concerns. As many of you may know, there are 2 or 3 vendors in testing and certification pipeline right now for 2.0. There will be more vendors submitting soon, and we will react and comply with the voluntary voting system guidelines 2.1 as amended once they are approved. And happy to answer any questions about that. Back to you, Commissioner.
Thank you, Chris. Isaac, you're recognized. Isaac Kramer.
Yep, thank you. Yes, Commissioner, thank you. I just have a couple things. I think it's like, what is the overarching goal of including this amended language? Is it because every system can, I believe, support hand-marked paper ballots? And if our systems for ADA purposes that have that QR code or barcode are feasible and they are allowed to continue, then why is that not good for all voters? If they're trusted for this one subsect of the community, and it's trusted and it's tested and it's passed everything with flying colors, then why then can it not be allowed for every other voter? Like, I think in Ohio, I think people have read that article that came out talking about how most of their voters prefer the ballot marking device versus a hand marked paper ballot. So if the goal is through this EO and also these updates to our language that we are to head toward hand marked paper ballots, then I think that's a different discussion, because I think that's where we're headed. And personally speaking, I'm not opposed to hand marked paper, but I also know that what's the future is. So if we're going to say we can't trust a QR code, we can't trust a barcode, then why are we going to trust the tabulation systems, the computer systems that are now doing those ballots? I mean, I'm concerned that we continue to make these updates, that an executive order could come in and say, okay, so now the tabulation systems can't read a certain way. They have to be under these standards. So that would be my concern. I'm not opposed to hand marked paper. I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. But I just think that if we're going to trust the voting system, and it passes through the certification requirements, it goes through the VVSG and it does everything under a QR code or a barcode. And then we're looking at public perception. It's like, yeah, this is good. And people who need it with the ADA community, they can use it, and it passes every system, and it's trusted, and it's been tested, and the election officials are testing it. But then when we go to normal voters, then we can't trust it there. It can't be allowed. That's not a good thing. So that's just a couple of my things. Just I know this is my first meeting, and I'm just learning a lot from y'all and listening. But I'm looking at VVSG 2.0, and there's a clear distinction now with the new draft. There's a clear distinction for barcodes that I believe wasn't really explicit in South Carolina, which is where I am. We do have a state law that does require us to follow within 36 months the federal standards. There are exceptions to that, but down the road we will have to adopt that system and that update. So it's a lot of money on the line here, and obviously every decision that is made affects all 50 states. It affects every jurisdiction, thousands of election officials, and our voters, millions of voters who use these systems. So it's something that we shouldn't tread lightly on. That's all I have.
Thank you, Isaac. Paul Lux, I'm going to recognize you, and then we'll go to Diane.
Thank you, Commissioner. I just wanted to echo the earlier comments, thanking John and Brooke for their for their explanation of part of what's driving this 2.1 draft. I like several people were unable to attend the January meeting when it sounds like a lot of this stuff was discussed. I was genuinely shocked when I opened 2.1 draft to see two completely new common data formats that I had heretofore not heard of, and all of the other changes about RFIs. I had kind of surmised that maybe that was, things that were questions that were submitted by vendors trying to get into certification or get through certification that had driven those. So I appreciate that change or that explanation, so that I have a better understanding of what a lot of the change in this document comes from. But as it relates to the E to EV stuff that was already mentioned, I would question then if anything involving E to E technology is going to require a voter verified paper record, other than a system that already has the E to E in their architecture. Why on earth would anyone then go to the trouble of putting together a system with E to E built in if they're just going to have to end up spitting out a piece of paper at the end that the voter can verify anyway? And to Mandy's earlier point too about the barcodes, of course, there's barcode references that, as far as I can see in the draft, remain unchanged in 3.3C and 3.3D, but in 9.1.5E, it just simply says, and everyone keeps saying that there's no change to what the barcode thing said, but there is, because in 9.1.5E, it used to just say all barcode representations of a voter's ballot selections must use an open and interoperable format. And that's all it said. Now they've added only be generated on an electronic voting system accessible by voters with disabilities. So that clearly is a massive departure from what barcodes were in 2.0 to 2.1. And I just wanted to make sure that I clarified that, because to say that it doesn't change anything that 2.0 had to do with barcodes, that's a bit of a major departure from that. And that's all I had to say. Thanks.
Thank you, Paul.
May I add a
Yes, go ahead,
quick
Mr.
comment,
Pan.
Chairman?
Yes.
And so thank you, Paul, for the point that you're making. I think we didn't see it as a major departure because a system certified with barcodes that store voter formats that aren't accessible wouldn't be possible. But we also think that, sorry, I'm looking at the language here. I apologize. I don't think I have that point to make anymore. I'll move on. Chairman, back to you.
Thank you, Mr. Panic. Diane, I recognize you.
Thank you. I apologize first. I have a number of issues that I need to get in the record, I guess, if this is the way we're going to do it. First, I'm going to echo what some of the other people said. My concerns have to do with the things that I think are substantive changes, and they're not based on tweaks or interpretations or anything else. But I'm also going to say, I think there's an underlying assumption problem, and then there's the translation into what has been proposed in 2.1. So first off, I was going to start with the easier one, which is actually the paper ballot mandate, but I'm going to start with the barcodes because we've had so much discussion about it already. I have to say again, the executive order says barcodes should only be used for tabulation as to accommodate people with disabilities. Well, that's like an oxymoron, because there is no accommodation. There's no access features involved in tabulation because that's not a voter-facing activity. So you guys are trying to implement this directive in an executive order, which I don't understand, because the exception you have is for accessibility, but accessibility features have nothing to do with tabulation. So I'm going to set that aside. What you did do in trying to implement that is to say exactly what was just described. You added the barcodes are nowhere mentioned in any accessibility standard ever. That's not, might be in a discussion as an example. Barcodes came into use in voting for tabulation, not for accessibility. They were being used for tabulation as an alternative to, optical scan position markers, whatever. It's just a different machine readable way of tabulation. And somebody all of a sudden said, woohoo, that makes it easier to provide verification of paper ballots for accessibility purposes, because it's in a digital machine readable form, so I can reconvert it for verification purposes. We did not drive the use of barcodes on the accessibility feature side. It's just that was more convenient than using the optical scan markings, because if you use OpScan markings to provide verification of the print on a piece of paper, you have to also have OCR to scan in write in, because otherwise all the system tells you is write in. It doesn't say you wrote in John Smith. So that doesn't satisfy the accessible verification requirement. So I'm going through all of this to make sure you understand that we're talking about two different things: tabulation and accessibility feature, which is for verification, not tabulation. Somehow the interpretation is that all electronic ballot marking devices have to have all accessibility features. Well, there is nothing explicit in the VVSG that actually says that. And I can tell you, when I asked in the years and years we were developing it, that's a scoping issue. Okay, I'm going to make this up, 50 accessibility standards. Do all 50 of those have to be in every piece of equipment? Well, that's another scoping question. And unfortunately, this ties into the RFI that was just issued that I'm going to tell you has major, major problems. And folding that into answering that scoping question of, does everything have to have all access features, or can you parse them out and have some with these access features and some with others, so that combined they would make the whole thing accessible? Or does it all have to be in one thing? We have not answered those questions explicitly in the VVSG, and yet it seems like on the testing side, there's some assumption you guys are making and applying them, and quite frankly, they're inconsistent because you're saying two different things. In this case, you're saying every digital interface has to have all the access features. Okay. Then your RFI says, oh, but never mind, if it's just a separate casting piece of equipment, that doesn't have to have all the access features. You can't do that. And it's an all, or it's a only one has to have it. Or if certain things apply to certain stuff, then you have to be explicit about that. These standards apply to ballot marking devices that mark and verify. These apply to casting devices that only cast, don't mark and verify. This is so much more complicated. So by trying to infuse this barcode requirement, new barcode requirement in the EO, along with trying to infuse now a clear paper ballot mandate, I am going to acknowledge that I agree. There was already a de facto paper mandate. But when we crafted the accessibility requirements, every time I tried to make sure that they were clear and explicit and unambiguous as applicable to a paper ballot, I was told I couldn't do that because we didn't have a paper ballot mandate. These standards had to be written in a way that could be applied to paperless systems if we ever got one that was secure enough. So when I go back through the accessibility standards, there are some, and I'm going to pull this one out, like 5.1-E, that literally the standard starts out with, if the voting system generates a paper record or determinative blah, 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 then, well, if we've got a paper mandate, then that standard needs to be changed because it's just a wrong standard. It needs to say the required voter verified paper ballot has to do this. All of the accessibility standards need to be reviewed to make sure they align with this new paper mandate, so it is clear and unambiguous what is required of what piece of equipment, ballot marking, verification, casting, all together, separate pieces. I tried to go through and start making those edits. Again, I did not have the time, but all I am saying is this is not a simple change. If you're going to do a paper mandate, okay, quite frankly, I think that's a more honest and above board way of approaching this than our prior kind of lip service. We've got to take time to look at those access standards and get them right so that they're not so that they're right in, for paper and it's clear, unambiguous. And we need to resolve that issue of, does everything have to have every access feature or not? And if not, where's the exceptions? So I like I said, I started drafting. I want to say one more thing about my concern with when we do this, and I agree, this is driving us toward hand-marked paper. It's driving us toward more segregated voting for people with disabilities on one machine in a corner that the poll workers don't know how to set up or use, etc. It is desirable to have lots of people using ballot marking devices rather than hand marking paper. And if that's the case, then I'm not opposed to ballot marking devices that don't have all access features, as long as there's a sufficient number of ones that do. If that is a better approach to deployment, I'm all for that. But right now the standards aren't clear. Or I will say, actually, the proposed seems to tell me I can't make a ballot marking device that doesn't have all the access features. So there are a lot of them out there and they're deployed now. So all of those are, my concern is in doing this, we're going to drive people to the one isolated, segregated, which I think everybody acknowledges is not really very efficient or useful in terms of getting, the one accessible thing working correctly. So all this is to say, there is a ton of work that needs to be done on the accessibility side of things. And, we're just nowhere near something that can be voted on.
Thank you, Diane. I know, Kevin, you've been waiting. Kevin Scoglin.
Thank you.
Recognized.
Thank you. I think we need to be really clear, especially with the public watching, what we are and aren't doing with barcodes, because I think it's not really clear right now. I think that my reading of the intention of the executive order was to change the status quo where barcodes were concerned. But what I'm hearing and what I'm reading in the draft is that the status quo is really not changing, that really the same systems would still be certifiable. And as an example, I'll use South Carolina, where Isaac is familiar. They use touchscreens for all voters, regardless of whether it has the accessibility devices connected to them or not. These are the same machines, and they go through the same VVSG certification regardless. Georgia's another case where you might have a polling place that has 10 touchscreens, the Dominion ImageCast X. 2 of those might have the accessibility features. There's not a clear, bright line between these systems. They go through certification as a single system. So I think some people may come away with the impression that we have banned barcodes in some cases, but I think we're not actually doing that. I think we're actually not saying that you have to have a hand-marked paper ballot for most voters. We're saying that the same systems can be used in both cases. And I think we just need to be more clear about that.
Thank you, Kevin. And I think that's in my opening comments when I talk about the fact that we're not banning barcodes because the president particularly pointed out that they should be available for voters with disabilities and as an accessibility feature, as I define it. And those decisions are the states and sometimes localities on what type of machine, what type of systems are going to be used in a polling place. And so those decisions will continue to reside most likely at the local level or state level. Our job at the EAC is to provide options in standards development and testing, and to provide those options to those states and localities that take one direction or the other. And that's my opinion as a commissioner. I think Brian Caskey was next. Thank you, Kevin. Brian, you're recognized.
Thank you, Chair. And thank you, everybody, for the discussion. I really appreciate everyone's viewpoints. My comments more about process. And I agree wholeheartedly with Diane in that I don't feel like we have enough input from disability groups today for various reasons. But I really want to kind of focus on process because I'm a process guy. And so in January, we did not have a quorum. And we talked quite a bit. I remember the discussion about being more nimble, and I agree wholeheartedly. But it shouldn't take us 10 years to go from 2.0 to 2.1. But I didn't come away with much clarity on how that was going to happen. We talked about updating the standards because of errors that were made in 2.0 that just needed to be fixed. There was nothing substantive to it, but we needed to clean those up. And we talked about the RFIs, but I don't remember seeing or being handed anything that listed out specifically what those were, with the assumption that we would get that in time for the 2025 annual meeting later this year. So I think my question is what are we going to do moving forward? Like normally we meet once a year, we have the information and plenty of time before then, and we review and recommend changes. Here, it feels like we're flying by the seat of our pants, with not enough time to really dive into a 328-page document, or that's a level of effort that, quite frankly, we haven't had enough time to do. We haven't had enough time to really, as a group, talk about all of the changes, whether they're substantive or not, because the law of unintended consequences in certifying voting equipment is real. And our voters expressed that to me. I know that you hear that, Chairman, but we have to be very deliberative here. And so here we are in the middle of the year, and it's clear that you're asking us for a vote, respecting the fact that it's our decision, but it's clear that's where you want us to be. And I'm just curious, is this the new normal that we're just going to ad hoc fly by the seat of our pants, or like what's our process here? What are we doing?
Well, the TGDC, as I described earlier, Brian, and I really appreciate your comments, and I understand your concern. I think that, the TGDC really is the first board that we go to provide that technical input, besides going to NIST, and sometimes it's a combination of NIST and TGDC. I think that because of, timelines on the executive order and the fact that there are been some changes over the last 4 years that are sort of part of the program already, are we ready to adopt a revision? And perhaps in January we weren't. But now is an opportunity for this board to provide comments and recommendations. It doesn't necessarily have to be in a resolution. In my mind, there's going to be plenty of opportunities, maybe not for everybody on this board, but the election community is going to have not only the other comment periods with the Standards Board and Board of Advisors, but there's also going to be public comment. And of course, we value the TGDC because of its technical acumen and that technical advice that can be provided to our team and to NIST, and we make sure we get this right. We've got plenty of public comments that came in, but we really value those comments that come directly from the stakeholders on this call, on this Zoom call, that, look, we think that, as Diane said, we think this, you're forgetting about this provision or this provision. You need to review that to make sure things are aligned. Or we don't necessarily agree with the language. We think it should be explicitly this way. Look, if there's the desire for a comment period post this, or to us to meet in 30 days, I want to give this board the opportunity to provide us comments. I understand the pressure that you're all under. I was serving on this board. I know it's difficult to find the time to literally go through a couple 100-page document and to provide substantive comments. But, and so my desire is, if there's particular comments, we've been recording this obviously over the next 30 days. If there's comments that can be provided to us, or if there's a resolution or a letter on particular issues, because that's really what this is about. We do value your general advice, but also if there's particular things of your expertise, we would value that information. Because I have full trust in our team, full trust in NIST, but I understand, going back even to 1.0, the election officials made that a better document. So I really need you, if it's through office hours or if it's through a period of 30 days, provide substantive comments on how do we make this a better product. Because in the end, thinking down the road, whatever document we come up, we'll have to determine as commissioners, is it ready to go? Is it ready for prime time? what is the impact on the election community and the registered manufacturers? And is this something that makes sense? And so we're starting that process now, and we just need the focus of this committee to be on this draft and to provide that feedback back to us. I know it can be difficult, but it's this is now the time to focus on this.
Chairman, if I may chime in. Thank you for the comments, Brian. I just wanted to say for everyone's understanding that, so we put a summary of everything that we proposed to put in the VVSG 2.1 draft in our 2024 VVSG review report, which we provided as read-ahead materials prior to the last TGDC meeting. That included an enumeration of each one of the RFIs, I believe, linked to the publications, but we've been reporting to the TGDC on RFIs that we've been publishing for 2.0 one at a time since we started issuing them in 2021. So all that said, it is a lot of material, and I agree with everything the chairman said. But just for the record, we've done, I believe, a fairly good job of presenting everything in advance that we've discussed previously. And so everyone's had an opportunity to look at it as of last year. So.
And I did just want to offer, again, as we've noted, public listening, public watching, Commissioner Palmer referenced comments received. We did get comments received for the purpose of this meeting. That does not satisfy the public comment requirement of HAVA. So I want to make that explicitly known that the public will have, through this process, an opportunity to comment with sufficient notice and timeline. That was some of the public comment we received on the guidelines themselves leading up to this meeting. Though the comment was for the TGDC receipt, not the public comment period required for voting system standards. So I want to do, just because we received so many public comments on that for the purpose of this meeting, make that abundantly clear that there will be sufficient time for public comment on the standards.
Thank you, Camden. I'll go to Judd Show. Recognize Judd.
Thanks, Don. So to this point, the comments that I've made have been totally process oriented, and that's sort of an MO for me. But I want to celebrate the fact that Diane and Kevin and others have really are diving into the substance here, and I wanted to sort of talk through what I thought could be our go forward from here, which you have already kind of alluded to. But I do have to go back to process. I do have a process question, which is, what if we all started working on individual revisions and we wanted to circulate them, and then let's say I'll just sort of randomly pick on people here. Let's say I picked up a phone and I called Mary and Wesley and said, hey, I want to get together and have a call with you guys and go over my comments. I'm worried, am I creating an open meeting issue because the committee has to do a public notice of a meeting of more than 2 members of the committee? Is that true? That's just my understanding of open record or open meetings generally, but do we qualify, or is it the fact that EAC is involved? Is it the fact that a commissioner is there that implicates those restrictions? Because it would be great if we could all kind of go to our corners and start exchanging some notes about some ideas we have, come to some general agreements on some draft language, and then come back and meet in 30 days, 60 days, 90 days, whatever that is, hopefully with additional members, some access board members. I'd love to see Mandy formally seated, and then we could have a fuller body and then actually go over those thoughts. So that's my sort of process question for you.
So, so we did have office hours, which I think obviously that had been pre-approved by the general counsel and the team. Camden, you probably have the particulars of when certain, what can we do on this when it comes to allowing discussion between members. Is there any
Yeah,
restriction? Go ahead.
So I'm going to give the EAC's view, but I want to pause, and I think that there might be a difference from NIST on their view on this, but it would be the EAC's view that that would be fine, Judd, so long as you're not providing advice directly to the commission and it's not controlled by the commission. So it is the EAC's view that what you presented would be acceptable, so long as any advice is presented in a public setting, which to me is the scenario that you presented. While this hasn't been discussed directly, I don't know if NIST has a different view on that, but that would be the EAC's response to your question.
Yes, this is Craig Burkhart from NIST. Unfortunately, NIST's point of view would have to be different because of its the TGDC is a FACA under NIST, and so the unfortunate result is that two members of the committee can speak with each other, but if you have three people on a phone together, that then becomes a public record and a Freedom of Information Act issue. So yeah, we would say that two people talking on the phone is just fine, but three people, then that brings in the deformities of public record into play. So we advise against doing that with our 7 committees that we have, across NIST. Thank you.
Thank you, Director. I don't see any.
Can I just follow up that? Sorry, it took me a second to sort of. Okay, I do understand, and that's why I asked the question. I think what that means is that we really should set up a series of meetings. I think we should have a meeting in 30 days, 60 days, and 90 days. And in those meetings, we should be bringing our drafts and we should be talking through language on those drafts, because that's really the only way you can get a committee to final language if that committee is restricted by open meeting limitations. So that would be my proposal, would be to get something on the calendar so we can start blocking out time.
Well, I appreciate that, Judd. I don't know if it's my decision or it's sort of a consensus here at the agency. My inclination is to give the TGDC 30 days to digest this and then to continue the office hours with our staff if there's technical questions. Obviously, you can talk with each other on a one-off basis. And I think that having that in writing would be the best. I think it would be the most efficient way. And so that's my preference as the designated federal officer, to get that input to our executive director as she looks at the draft and receives the input that was heard today. So that's my preference as a designated federal officer, and have not yet run that by the general counsel, but that would be my preference. Mary?
Hi, thanks. Thank you. This conversation has been really, really valuable. I do appreciate everybody's input, all the comments. I also appreciate the notations on the document that we were provided to review as to what the source of the suggested changes were, if it came from the executive order or request for interpretation or technical corrections. And so just a suggestion, I don't know if this will facilitate the TGDC members' review. It sounds to me as if most of the issues are surround the changes made to respond to the executive order. I would think technical corrections should be relatively easy to lowest priority. Requests for interpretation, since they've already been published, I would put second priority, and top priority would be changes or edits or concerns related to the specific issues we talked about with barcodes and the introduction of a new common data format inclusions. So in terms of review within the 30-day, would it be helpful to focus first on the highest priority edits and look to those first, and then putting the technical corrections at the lowest, and particularly, I would say, the request for interpretation, which I think should have already been public and would be helpful to incorporate into the document. So just a suggestion.
Thank you, Mary. I think Diane was next, and then we'll get to David Wagner.
First, a clarification. So Jed made one suggestion, and Commissioner Palmer had what I think was something very different. And I'm trying to figure out, are we considering one or the other or both, or are we gonna, for me and the things that I'm concerned about related to accessibility, I have a couple of pages drafted of actual edits, the classic strike through, add this, the, full blown. But again, I picked out the high priority, low hanging fruit ones that I knew needed to be fixed, like striking language that says if there's a paper ballot, since now there is a mandatory paper ballot, I'd need to do a more comprehensive review. But I'm not clear on what, so should I send this to everybody, or is that a, information problem? How are we gonna, I'm just not, I'm gonna say this and hopefully it does not come across terribly negative. My experience has been that I come from the accessibility world and the legal floor of accessibility. There is just a real disconnect between what I verbally say describing an issue and then how that ends up translated in a standard, unless I write it and vet it with the community and we make sure it says what it needs to say explicitly and clearly and cannot be misinterpreted. So that is our preference for trying to remediate the issues, to move something forward, to address in particular the two EO issues. And I'm going to backtrack and say that last RFI is a real, I think the intent is fine, but it's worded so the summary part that was pulled and put in the VVSG will not work, just will not work, has got to be revised. So anyway, I'm just not clear if we're still discussing how to move forward or how we're going to resolve this.
So thank you, Diane. My inclination is to provide 30 days for written comment and offer our staff as office hours continuing for that technical advice. And then you are permitted, I don't think there's any prohibition with you talking to multiple members of the accessibility community, or as the director said, one member of the TGDC independently. And so that's my preference moving forward, is that we have an opportunity for written comments. And I don't rule out perhaps another meeting, but I think we need to get the feedback to our staff and to our executive director so they can start preparing for the other FACA advisory boards. Mr. Wagner, you're next.
Thank you. I'll share my preferences here, my perspectives, and I'm coming from a similar place as Judge Choate. I think that as the TGDC as a group, we have I feel that we have a responsibility to discuss any proposal and make a recommendation to the EAC on a proposed standard. And I think that we're going to do that best if we can put our heads together and all benefit from the different kinds of expertise we bring to this. So I think that being able to discuss proposals that individuals have would be very helpful. And I would find it helpful if we could have a couple of calls. I would really like to see the language that Diane is bringing forward. I have some very minor changes that I would propose. I would guess other people might have language as well. And I'd find it really helpful to be able to hear everyone's perspectives and then aim towards a goal of having the TGDC be able to vote on a proposed draft that we could recommend to the EAC. So thinking about what it would take to get there, to get to a point where the TGDC could vote on a proposed draft and vote on a recommendation to the EAC that in support of the proposed draft, I think that would be more likely to be successful if there's some venue where we could have a phone call to discuss if members could send their proposals to everyone else, and we could have a phone call where we could discuss those. And so if it's a matter of timing, if 90 days is too long, if there's a way to have 1 or 2 phone calls over the next month among the TGDC, I think that'd be really helpful. To me, I don't see each member providing their own written comments to the director of the EAC as a written comment as a sort of an equal substitute for reaching apart for the TGDC meeting as a whole and deciding on proposed language and making a recommendation on a proposed standard. So obviously it's not my call, but thank you for the opportunity to share a perspective here and for
Thank you, Mr. Wagner. We're going to take that on board, and I think we've done some phone calls in the past, so I will consult with former DFO who's done some of those phone calls and also the general counsel, and we'll let the membership know how we're going to move forward in the next 30 days. So I think Mandy is next. Mandy.
Yeah, thank you, Commissioner. Thanks, Commissioner. I would just kind of echo the comments in sharing that I think this has been really valuable. This is kind of my first meeting, and I have certainly learned quite a bit. I think the collaboration and the various perspectives are incredibly valuable. So I would echo that additional calls to have discussion, in particular, since it's not welcome that or not appropriate for us to be having those outside of this venue. I think that makes it even more important that we have kind of a formal ability to have these conversations. There are a lot of different entities represented that all give, important perspective. So I would just echo that multiple calls I think are going to be necessary. I just want to kind of clarify a point that came up in the past about, I certainly support not waiting 4 years for us to make adjustments. Like, I think it is valuable to continue to modernize and continue to make improvements. So I support that, but I also support some sort of process that we can kind of base our administration on. What is it going to look like? Something that we all know what's coming and when, so that we can plan accordingly. I think we're all willing to put in the work, but I think ultimately we can agree that this is a little bit out of what we've been used to, at least for this committee, from my understanding in the past. So I think we're open. I think we'll do good work, and I just think we need some space and ability to really support that. I don't think written comment in the next 30 days is going to get us there. So I do think this discussion needs to continue. So that would be kind of my ask of this group. And also, I'm just going to, again, just advocate that we get a full representation. I think everyone spoke to, well, there's not a technical legal prohibition on continuing without full representation, but I think the makeup of the committee, was intended to get a full perspective. And I think we can only do that with folks having a seat at the table. So I am open to continuing whatever conversations need to be had to get us there.
Thank you, Mandy. Now recognize Paul Lux.
I would just, as a point of clarification, be interested to hear Camden or someone else's, perhaps the chair's thoughts on, for the purposes of that 2-member rule, would you consider proposed members as part of that? Meaning, could me and Mandy and Wes and Kevin all get on a phone call, since they are not technically members yet? that might spur maybe people in the direction of let's get them on the board so that we can be doing everything we're supposed to be doing.
From the NIST standpoint, potential members are not members, and so they would not count against that prohibition.
Okay. So the next item on the agenda was if there's any resolutions proposed by the members. Based on our previous discussion, there may not be a resolution, but I'll leave it open to the membership on that point. And if not, if there's silence for more than 30 seconds, I'm going to move on to wrap this up.
Judd, did you want to make a resolution formally about having additional meetings or phone calls, or how do we think maybe that's best to proceed?
I guess I will leave it in the hands of Commissioner Palmer and the EAC to devise a schedule that meets our needs. My advice though is that committees writing a document is really hard, and so multiple bites of the apple and opportunities to see language and go back and forth is probably advisable. So I think in a perfect world, we put a couple of meetings on the calendar, and then if they aren't necessary because we're able to come to a quick resolution, great, we can always cancel. But we all have complicated schedules, and I worry that if we try to do 30 days out over and over, we're not going to be able to get to a quorum. So.
Okay.
Mr. Caskey, you're recognized.
Thank you, Chair. Well, then I'll make the motion. I was going to do it later, but since we're being asked, I believe, to adopt or make a recommendation on 2.1, I want to point out that in all the previous versions, it took many meetings to get to the final version of the standard, and I believe that we need to have a nuts and bolts, hear everyone's take on the wording of all of the changes. And so I'm well aware of the time pressure with the EO, but I'm also well aware that I believe strongly that we need to have at least one more, if not multiple more meetings of the members to nuts and bolts. I saw in the chat that one of the members has several substantive changes they'd like to make. I know Diane does. I know several of us do. And so I'm proposing that we have another meeting by the end of the month that's strictly nuts and bolts. I would like there to be some effort on adding members who haven't been there, that have been stuck, so that they can attend that meeting and get us closer to being able to actually decide on what our recommendation is on 2.1. So I'm turning that into a motion. I move that we have another meeting of this group by the end of the month to talk about nuts and bolts.
I will second that motion.
We have a motion and a second. Any objection?
I'll just chime in. Can I just want to ask,
So
are we trying?
Isaac, you're recognized for a question, comment?
Yes. Thank you, Commissioner. Jumping out of there. I was just excited. It's been a long call. I guess my question is, are we trying to make minor updates is that the goal here, or are we trying to make major overhauls to 2.0? Because if there's like a lot of updates that need to be made, then maybe that's different than what the EAC believes is the direction we're supposed to be headed. That is my question. I'm just, if we're opening this up to have every page looked at and every review, are we just looking at the edits that have been made, or are we actually looking at the broad document document and trying to update each section or each part of it.
Well, Isaac, I will just say from a having been on the board for a while perspective, before 2.0 was approved, we did spend a lot of time going through it section by section. And okay, does anyone have any discussion points, anything we need to talk about? And it led to a lot of long meetings. And yes, some of that work was done outside, i.e. like via like emails, and like somebody referenced earlier, we did have phone calls and things about that, where we could have those discussions and still maintain the number of people we're supposed to have. But it's obviously the RFIs have been published out there for a while, but you know there's maybe some tweaking from some of those RFIs. You can't just throw them in there. When we historically loaded the first version of VVSG 2.0, it was those 15 high-level assertions and the 53 underlying assertions, and that was going to be the standard. And then all the nuts and bolts of the actual testable assertions and all those things were going to be left to NIST to manage. We wouldn't be here if that had happened. That's not how it happened, and we ended up with the elephant that you have to eat in very small bites again, which was the problem with the earlier versions of the VVSG back when we numbered them with years instead of 1.0 and 2.0. So just from historical perspective, you know, this probably needs that again, just because some of those RFIs are reaching pretty deep into some territory. I mean, I realize that they've already published the RFI. So yes, that information has already been provided to the person who asked the question, and that now we're just incorporating into the standards. But some of that might require more discussion, certainly from the not present accessibility community, which is probably and been a concern voice with many people.
Mary, you're recognized.
Thanks. And I would just add, based on those comments, that it really depends on what the Election Assistance Commission is looking for, what type of document and how quick a turnaround to send out to begin the update process. If 2.1 is intended to be largely technical corrections and additions of already accepted requests for interpretation that are not questioned, then the TGDC might, and that's a quick turnaround, and then the TGDC might, members would talk about those. What are the easy ones to get through? What are technical corrections? What are easily agreed requests for interpretation? Don't require a lot of additional wording. And then also flag those items where it would require a deeper dive, and that those changes should be subject to a longer discussion in any later version. If that's what you're looking for, I think we could, probably have a 30-day process for what are the low-hanging fruit. We could get into a 2.1 and what is necessary to table for a longer discussion.
So before we wrap this up, I'm not going to ask our general counsel to provide rules of the road. What I think is best is that, for example, many of us deal with open records and FOIA, everything we write down on a post note is a FOIA-able document. So there may be a way of communicating via email that is just going to be open to the public regardless. I'm going to ask the general counsel to give some rules of the road, actual consultation with NIST on sort of that process, as well as continuing the office hours. And we will take all these comments under advisement on how we're going to move in the next 30 days. Any other comments?
Yes, if you don't mind.
Yes, yes.
One thing we always have to remember when we're part of a FACA committee, and we are a FACA committee that is specifically in existence to advise the EAC, is that essentially the life of our committee and what we do as a committee is to be in direct response to what the EAC would like, or what the advice that they are looking for. We want to be responsive to that. We don't have a sort of a general existence of going off and looking at other things, if you will, to provide advice to the EAC on. We have, they focus us, we do those tasks. Hopefully we do them in a work person-like way. And what we have to say is useful to the EAC. The EAC can accept or reject our advice. We can be responsive. We can be, I suppose, unresponsive to their requests. Naturally, what they're looking for is they're looking for responsiveness to their requests, and they're looking for responsiveness that's directly relevant to what they are asking. So as people start to think about what they want to engage in conversation wise and so forth over the next 30 days or whatever this timeline is going to be that the chair and the general counsel are going to come up with, we need to be focused on those things and remember that we don't have a sort of a generalized, unlimited remit. We are to focus on answering what they want us to. That's our job. And I just wanted to make sure that I shared that thought. Thank you.
Thank you.
By the way, it's nice meeting everybody on this call.
Thank you, Director. Before we do have a motion that was on you might want to repeat that for the record. This is a resolution to the Election Assistance Commission.
Hey, Don, can I respond to the director real quick? So I respect what you're saying, Director. The problem is that that's not what the law says. The law says in section 222 of HAVA, it says that the TGDC effectively writes the VVSG, and it makes the recommendation to the EAC. So yes, it's true that we don't exist because for any other purpose than to advise the EAC, but we begin the process. So the fact that we are, one of the problems with the way we've gotten to this point is that we didn't begin this process. The president began this process, and the EAC has decided to follow the guidance of the president and start the wheels turning toward this revision. Well, that's not what the law says. The law says that we start this process. And so, yes, I get it that we advise the EAC, but that's really counter the specific wording of HAVA, at least in my interpretation. So I respect your perspective on this, but the law sort of points us in a slightly different or nuanced way that counters that.
So I would just clarify that doesn't match the EAC's interpretation. And we certainly agree that the TGDC is part of the process. And I think it's pretty explicit on the initial set of recommendations for the VVSG following the passage of HAVA, which were well passed. But on modifications, we do need to seek the recommendations of the TGDC, but there's nothing explicit in HAVA that requires the drafting of those modifications start with the TGDC. And I think that's an overly strict interpretation of 222 and not in process. Happy to have the conversation, but we are, to make it clear, that is not what the EAC is operating under.
All right, so there's a motion. I think it was Brian Caskey who made a motion. You requested of the EAC a number of things. An additional meeting. Do you want to repeat your motion or?
Yeah, so I move that we meet no later than the end of the month to have a discussion among all the TGDC members about what's in the current version of 2.1. And from my perspective, to make any recommendations to changes to 2.1. In addition, I would strongly encourage the powers that be to add the missing members of the committee in any way, shape, or form so they can participate in that meeting.
Okay. That is the motion. I believe there was a second, but I'm looking for a second.
I seconded the motion.
Okay. And do I have the ayes?
Aye.
Aye.
Right.
Aye.
Any nays? Okay. The recommendation to the EAC has passed. And I do see another hand up, or is that now lowered? Okay. So, let's see here. So before we leave, are there any closing comments? We are closing up on the 4 o'clock hour Eastern time, but before we adjourn, are there any closing comments or thoughts from folks on members of the committee? Judd, you're recognized.
Yeah, thanks, Don. So again, I know I've been sort of totally consumed by process. I'm going to drop that for a second. We need our members. So please, NIST and other entities that are involved in that process, get our members formally seated so that we can include them in the actual policy making that this body does.
Thank you, Judd. Diane, you're recognized.
I'm just asking another question that's in the chat. So
Diane, you're breaking up. Could you repeat? Could you start over?
Sorry. I'm going to ask the question again about how do we share our edits, or do we, before the next meeting?
If you've already been providing the same means of transmission, but we'll have our either our AFDO or General Counsel will provide the means to provide those recommendations or modifications.
Let me clarify. I'm not talking about I can send recommendations to the EAC kind of at any point, just as a public member. I'm talking about sharing. My edits are going to come from the accessibility perspective, not any other section. And if other members are going to be able to discuss this when we meet next time, I really think they need to be able to see those ahead of time.
Oh, yeah.
Just like, yeah. So I'm asking about that.
But we'll have Diane, we'll have a mechanism to share those with the rest of the members. Those comments or those modifications, recommendations.
Yeah, and I'll allow NIST to chip in, but written record, right, is noting that it's foiable, but okay with circulation of those, Diane. So
Kevin, you're recognized.
I just want to make a sort of big picture comment that I think that the EAC and the TGDC need to do some long-term planning, 10 years, 15 years, 20 years out, and to start thinking about those issues. And I realize that this is obviously front and center right now, but I think we would be remiss if we don't start making those longer-term plans.
Thank you, Kevin. So at this point, I'm going to adjourn the meeting. And I'll entertain a motion to adjourn the meeting. Is there a member? Is there a member?
I move to adjourn.
Do I have a second?
So I'm just since we're being highly technical, Director, you can't move.
That's right. You're absolutely right. I'm the chair. So Don, you can move.
I'm not sure I can. I'm the DFO. So I think I saw Isaac about to go to.
Two other people.
Is there a second to adjourn the meeting?
Second.
Any objection? So no objection. So it's moved and seconded that this body adjourns the meeting. I'll now take a voice vote to adjourn. All in favor, say aye.
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 All opposed, say nay. Okay, the ayes have it. The meeting's adjourned. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you.